Okay, in this video, we're going to be talking about why trade deficits do not matter. And for this, we need to explain what exactly trade is when we're talking about trade deficits. Basically, when they're viewing trade deficits, this is merely a economic indicator that basically is taking the full amount of trade from individuals, companies from one country, and comparing them when they interact with another country. Now, the problem being when they actually use this is it's trying to basically state what the actual net figures are when dealing with one country. Now, with that other country. Now, even globally with it, when you're looking at these figures with it, it doesn't assume what type of industry, what type of things that you actually produce with it, what your actual companies are actually requesting from these other countries specifically. They could be requesting only component parts. You're actually making the final product, and if you're requesting a bunch of money in component parts, and a lot of your money is being sold domestically, and not enough of export to other nations, you could end up producing a massive trade deficit globally. And this would require that you would then be viewed as a whole country, or even with other industries that might have the whole thing coming in. This means basically, even though you're producing a bunch of stuff coming in, because you're producing so much gains in your still in your company, because you went overseas to get these component parts, you are now actually or full units, you are now actually becoming creating the country as a quote unquote trade deficit for the country. Now, the reason why this is an erroneous type of economic figure and should never be actually used is it doesn't equate out to what type of a country that your country might be. Now, if your country is making a lot of things in banking, insurance, which the U.S. does have quite a bit. The U.S. doesn't have as much industry as it used to, because frankly, it's gone away from this, and we've exported some of this and moved into more of the financial sector. It's going to, in much of the light of areas like what Switzerland's done, you're going to have less and less and less areas of trade, because to actually deal with such things as banking, as insurance, they are completely omitted from the trade. Countries such as Switzerland actually have massive trade deficits. Now, when you view Switzerland, you're going to actually see that Switzerland is actually an extremely wealthy country. Now, if this idea of having a trade deficit was so bad, why isn't Switzerland actually a massively poor country? And why aren't these countries that are relying so much more on industry far wealthier? Just because you're relying on industry does not necessarily guarantee any wealth. It just means that is your cornerstone of your country. There are plenty of countries that basically have relied on industry. There are plenty of countries in Eastern Europe that do this, and they are not exactly your wealthiest countries. People are living in massive poverty while still having actually having a trade surplus. Specifically, ones that are still producing things such as audio tubes and other like component parts such as this. They're actually doing this, and they have a few different industries that a lot of people work in them, and because of this, they're actually end up having a trade surplus. Yet the people are actually not exactly considered the wealthiest, specifically even by European standards. And when you start to look at this, you can actually compare them with this. You can even look in even areas of Asia with it, and we can actually see that areas like India have a trade surplus, yet you look at India, most of the country is dirt poor, and they have a trade surplus as well. So we can actually see that it doesn't equate out to anything being a beneficial thing. It just means you actually have more industry producing things and less service. When you start to break, if you were to break down India between what they actually are doing, the industrial areas with it that are actually getting the quote unquote trade surplus are actually the poorest areas in the country. The ones that are actually getting the actual the negative on trade are actually the wealthiest areas within the country. So when we start to see this on the trade, this is why we cannot view this. What is actually happening with it is when trade happens, trade is not a government to government acquisition or even a business to government acquisition. That very rarely happens. Number one, it's not government to government because there's only a handful of governments with it, and most of them are very, very poor, such as North Korea, Venezuela are the only ones that are or Cuba, things like this. They're the only ones that are fully centralized into what their industries are actually doing. Even even mainland China does not do this. So we know that this is not what's going on. When we look at comparing the ideas of what actually goes on in the actual things of even just company through their governments, of company to other government spending, that's through trade like that, very, very little of that actually occurs. So there's not actually a lot of things that happen with that. That's usually through defense contractors having special crony deals that actually happen. Very little of that happens around the globe. That's a very, very small percentage. Most of this is either A, consumers buying from businesses overseas, or B, businesses buying from other businesses overseas, as they have for actually multiple, not only multiple decades, but actually in more than one century. And this is what's actually occurred. And this has actually been. And this has actually been what's actually the actual cause of the whole thing. And when we actually see that there is an actual problem of trade where trade's been restricted because of tariffs, this has actually been an issue of this is because they erroneously look at, oh my God, our country has a trade deficit. Because you get people like Donald Trump who've actually erroneously looked at these things and say that they had, oh my God, we have a trade deficit. Not even viewing anything legitimately, because they're saying, oh my God, we have a trade deficit, we have to do something about it, instead of viewing the thing legitimately. And we see people like that basically want to use authoritarian systems to basically force companies to build things here that basically make things far more expensive, who want to basically put tariffs on raw materials, want to basically raise the cost of things, want to raise the cost of full units being imported back here, which raises the cost for the average family to get something such as a dishwasher or a dryer, and can add as much as over $100 onto any one of these units, when it's just the average middle class or poor family that are just basically trying to get by. And these ideas in which are coming from, and they're still and these policies are still on the books, even in the Biden administration, which shows that basically they have not been eliminated. Is what we're seeing is that basically people are still being harmed by these policies, by completely not understanding how trade works. Trade is basically, it's a voluntary system of one person trading with another for the actual personal benefit of them actually gaining wealth. And it's not going to change. They're not actually going to have a system in which they're going to lose money. Neither side's going to actually do any type of deal in which they're going to lose money on the deal or give away more value than they feel it's fair. And what ends up happening is you get government officials who go on these little ideas with it, and they get people to buy into these ideas with it without them understanding what is actually happening, because they're not understanding the whole supply chain of what's actually occurring. So they get people to buy into these ideas. You were first seeing a lot of these ideas go back to people like Ross Perot that was getting people to actually buy into this garbage when we were actually with the ideas of NAFTA. Now, while NAFTA wasn't perfect because there was still not full free trade with it, it was still somewhat structure of a trade deal that was making it a lot easier to move goods. They claim he made all these weird claims that it was going to ruin jobs in America. Meanwhile, the actual outcome was that we gained jobs, and not only did we gain jobs, we actually gained cheaper price goods from both Mexico and Canada, and this was the actual benefit of it. And because of this actually helped out the consumer. The consumer was spending less money, and this allowed us to actually overcome the actual excessive spending of the United States government that was actually causing a lot of issues with excessive spending, which was basically inflation. And when you have that, that's going to basically when you're causing the price of goods to go down slightly faster than inflation, it's going to basically put more money and more purchase power in the hands of the people. This is why trade is always good. Even through ineptitude of government, it's always going to beat the ineptitude of government. We're even seeing those benefits even through the Obama years. Even through Obama, as inept as he was, trade was still able to beat his ineptitude of government and his massive inflation that he was actually running through with excessive spending and with the excessive ability for basically racking up debt that was actually occurring during his years. Now, what Trump was doing was Trump was basically reversing on that, saying basically we're not going to do trade, which is going to basically raise the price of goods, and we're basically going to do more spending. We're going to basically irritate these companies that are going to be buying that are normally buying the debt bonds, which meant we were going to experience the inflation at a much harsher rate with it, meaning basically instead of being it kind of delayed and given over a certain period of time, we were going to experience it immediately, and everybody was going to experience it. And the only people that are going to basically be able to weather the storm are going to be the extremely wealthy, because they're the ones that are going to be able to handle any of this type of inflation, and that basically in the end with it, when it kind of everything hits, they're the ones that are going to be able to buy up any assets that start to crash out. And eventually with it, because eventually what's going to happen is you're going to have assets get too expensive, and it's going to have to lead to a deflation. Once the deflation hits and more expensive assets, when people can't afford anything, they're the ones that are going to pretty much be buying up those assets. And that's when we're talking about the reason why we're talking about that encouraged to this idea of these trade things with it. Basically, when you have people fighting the idea of trade, it just basically all you're doing is you're making the poor get poorer, the middle class become poor, even the barely wealthy can drop down to what the level of the middle class are with it. Only the very, very wealthy are able to withstand the storm. The idea of trade has always been something to actually make people wealthier from the start, and that's been the whole idea of it. This is why we're talking centuries have always been pushing for trade, because from the wealthiest to the poorest, they've required goods. We've only found that pretty much due to the landscape that actually China's been the only country that we can actually think of that actually is something that is functioning where they can actually be self-sustaining. No country out there is actually self-sustaining, and the United States knew that they were never self-sustaining when it comes down to their function. We've always been one that's actually relied on global trade, even from our inception. We had times when we were basically willing to kind of push for our independence at our start, that we were willing to push away from certain countries for trade at the start with it. But if you look at the actual real story with it, we are still taking the product out and tossing out the packages. So we are still using the product. We just refuse to actually pay the fees on them with it, because the fact is we were against this idea of these tariffs on it. Tariffs are basically which are a way to push away from trade, is a way as being un-American as possible. And this idea of basically viewing as these trade deficits as being something negative, if we're going to basically produce more and more ideas of selling insurance, selling banking globally, you're not going to selling telecom communications globally, you're not going to essentially have these things that are going to be where you're going to be a very high production in industry anymore. And that's frankly the truth. We're not going to be as much in industry. If you look at what we've actually been producing, it's a lot of things in service. And this is where the United States has gone over the last 30 years. If you look at where we've been in the last 30 years, this is where our actual focal point has been. We've been moving away from this because industry, especially for salaries, does not pay that much. We've been going into especially developing in medical ideas with it and exporting out the technology to actually become very wealthy with that. So we're actually into developing things. We're just not actually into the manufacture. We've gone away from manufacturing. So what this means is that what we will do is we will develop things and we'll have the manufacture overseas. We will actually do things such as a lot of service things. So what ends up happening is we're moving away from that. We're moving into the idea of a lot of service, and we're not doing manufacture, because manufacture is, number one, it's highly dangerous for the actual individuals involved, because you get many, many more injuries. And as societies start to develop, they're going to actually move away from this. The less advanced societies are going to do less of your manufacturing and less of your more dangerous jobs, and hand those out to more developing regions for them to start to develop. And eventually we will find more things in robotics that are going to be doing this to actually limit the danger that our people are basically exposed to. Now, when we go to what we're exporting that is actually being manufactured here, what's actually the problem when we're saying, why aren't we exporting some of these goods, such as motorcycles or cars? Well, when we start to look at our cars and motorcycles, they're actually geared toward people in the United States. They're geared toward our lane sizes. They're geared toward our actual needs of our drivers. They're not actually geared toward basically a universal idea of what regions of the world might want. We're not setting up anything when it comes down to that. So you can't say, okay, we had this thing set up purely for the United States. Like, let's look at Harley Davidson. We have motorcycles geared to the United States. You can't say, well, okay, why aren't you using them in China? Well, China wants more nimble, smaller bikes, and your bikes are much larger. They're not going to say, okay, we'll be willing to buy your bikes with it, even though they would actually be the complete opposite of what we want. They're far more expensive, they're far louder, and they do not fit the need of the people that we want. The people in our country do not want them. You can't physically force people to buy things. I mean, if that were the case with it, I mean, you would not see any failed products that have ever been gone into manufacture. I mean, you would not see failed companies ever. The idea of a failed company or failed project, I mean, the idea of all those that laundry list of failed ideas from Donald Trump in his company with it, which were all the ones that he proposed, would not have happened if the idea that you could just force people to enter into these things without basically expecting people to buy them. And the fact is we saw a bunch of these things fail with it. If the idea that you could merely force people to buy these things, and this is how the economy worked, it would be business would be far easier. But business is about making sure that you basically bring something to the market that people want to buy. Now, what we have in our vehicles, in our motorcycles that are produced here, are things that basically they're not actually wanted globally. And that's the issue. They're not wanted in Europe because of basically the way they're designed, and they're not wanted out in Asia because of the way they're designed. They're completely erroneous when it comes down to it. Now, because of our lack of regulation, we're actually allowed to manufacture a lot of vehicles that are foreign vehicles as well. So for those saying, oh my God, the trade deficit, well, the fact is we're having a lot of other foreign companies, because of the cost that it puts on those companies to build the vehicles. They're building vehicles right here in the United States. So it's not like we're having a lack of manufacturing happen. They're actually doing it here within the United States, and they have been for quite some time. And it's had nothing to do with Donald Trump. This has actually happened because of the lack of regulation that had already existed. And because their home countries are far more expensive. We're seeing from companies in Japan, because Japan's inflation is astronomical. We're seeing from all the regulations out in Europe, because the regulations out in Europe are astronomical, so we're finding them here. And because of that, that makes it far easier for those companies to come here and deal with it on U.S. soil. And they've done this for not just one decade, but multiple decades. And they're actually building things here. Now, because of this, because they're actually building and because they're importing things over, this is being seen as negative on the trade deficit. It's being seen as a quote-unquote import. Now, we're actually manufacturing these things, and when we import the goods and export the things out, they're actually what it called, because it's within the same company, many times it's what it called, it's being seen as an actual loss on the things. Now, meanwhile, that it's actually economically benefiting our actual nation, these things are actually being seen as a negative. Meanwhile, we're actually having a huge economic benefit. This is another thing why we actually can't rely on this number. If we start to view it, the best way, I think, was when Joe Jorgensen stated it best with it, is when viewing the trade deficit, is you have is explaining that you have a trade deficit with your gas station. You're buying gas from the gas station, and the gas station's not buying anything from you. This is what's going to happen. The idea is you're not going to, and she was a libertarian candidate for president. Now, this is the whole idea, is you're not going to have people always buying things from you. Sometimes you're just going to sell things. Sometimes you're going to sell things to people. Sometimes people are going to sell things elsewhere with it. And it's not always going to come out even, because sometimes you just end up going to be a consumer. Now, a consumer of goods with it is fine with it. Now, what the trade deficit really is all it's measuring is who's moving manufacturing. Who's taking manufactured goods and moving it. It has nothing to do with services. And because if it was moving services, the number would be quite different. This is basically who's taking manufactured goods with it, or mined goods, and who's moving it which way. And basically who's moving more of it. This is basically whoever has the what I call the biggest surplus is basically who has the most archaic government, who has the most archaic economy. This should be what it should be a viewpoint of. If you had the biggest surplus, you had the most archaic economy. And I'm not saying surplus in the actual raw sense, in the actual number, but I'm saying as a percentage of your actual total economy itself, and of the actual exports with it. When you're showing that percentage of the exports, if that's the huge amount, then you're talking that your economy is archaic. And if your economy is far more working toward service, that's showing that you are far more of a modern economy. You're not you're not putting your civilians at risk. You've evolved to more the idea of having robots do the hard labor, so that other people can actually focus on the development, have the development being done overseas. This allows for the vehicles and other manufactured goods to be far cheaper, so when they actually purchase it, it's an actual benefit. This is the thing with it. Like, let's say, for example, we were only purchasing medication that was developed within the United States. The medication, because of our labor costs and our slow rate of labor, would be far too expensive. But because we're able to actually develop the medication here, and we're able to sell the actual stuff over to where generic companies can actually produce it, with an actual fee going back to the original company, this allows that to be a situation to where they can actually produce these medications at a fraction of the cost, ship them back to the United States, and you can actually get them through your either insurance company or directly from the pharmacy at a fraction of the cost. If you look at the actual difference, you'll see a very, very big difference between the huge name brands and these generics. In many cases with it could be 1/10 of the cost. And we end up seeing what happens when government intervention comes in. When government intervention comes in, we see that basically you can have massive inflation on these things if generics aren't allowed to exist, if you were being forced to actually buy domestic goods. That would be basically equal to the same if you were trying to enforce the idea of where no goods were available to come in. This is the idea of protectionism, and what trying to force a trade surplus would do, saying we have to manufacture all this stuff at home, and what ends up doing, it basically creates a massive increase in prices. Doesn't matter if we're talking medication, doesn't matter if we're talking trying to create all the components for phones here in the United States. Doesn't matter if we're talking for vehicles, creating all the components for vehicles here in the United States. The cost would be so astronomical because we have workers that go far too slow and workers that cost far too much. They're not worth the money. Sorry to tell people this, but this is just the fact. And the fact is this is where it comes from. And when we start to view this, is companies want to basically get the most bang for their buck, and this is where they need to go. And what the end result is when they move manufacturing to be the best quality, the most efficient, and move them into those areas and get them shipped back, that ends up being a benefit to the customer. Now, what ends up happening is that shows us basically because we have these huge macro numbers of such things as trade surplus, people don't know how to view them correctly. It just means there's no manufacturing within the country. Now, when you have companies that are basically shutting down other areas such as your service industries, that becomes very, very bad for a country like that. When you see service industries start to taper off as well, those are actual serious problems. That means you're talking that the economy is actually moving in a negative light. When you see basically people are moving toward a lot of fast food jobs, a lot of basically jobs like that with it, and they're moving in that area with it, and the service industry and like the R&D industries are basically moving in a negative direction. This is actually something very, very bad. You don't want to be seeing that. You want to be seeing those industries basically expanding and the actual manufacturing going down. This shows you that the country is actually becoming wealthier. Just in the lines of like Hong Kong. Hong Kong originally was a heavy manufacturing country. They moved away from this. They're now based off trade and in trade and services. They're very, very wealthy now. It doesn't matter what mainland China's done to them on a personal liberty. They're always going to be. They cannot take away their economic liberty because that would actually destroy them as an actual country. This is why they haven't really done much when it comes down to their actual countries, their actual companies within mainland China either. It means too much to them overall with it. They would anything that they would do, it would actually destroy them. And this is how we're going to have to go forward with actually developing wealth. And the fact is, we can't just all of a sudden go back to an era and become one of these archaic type of countries, because it's just going to basically be putting us backwards. We need to basically get back to honest monetary policy and basically start getting people on reasonable rates of pay, or get them to actually produce more, and get basically replace the jobs that are obsolete. Stop trying to be compassionate, but replace the jobs that are obsolete, and end up getting to the point where we actually don't need them anymore. But there's obviously going to be certain jobs that we still need, and then obviously go to the point to where we're actually getting more service jobs out there with it that are actually high production jobs in a lot of R&D, in a lot of banking, in a lot of things like insurance, because these are the things that are actually going to pay and going to create a beneficial country. And realize that when it comes down to trade is individual to individual, company to company, or company to individual. It has nothing to do with governments. governments are basically viewing it from government to government is really an erroneous way with it. That this is the whole point. This is why the whole idea of trade surpluses and trade deficits is really an erroneous thing, and it's really been kind of an abused talking point. And the only point in which it becomes necessary is when you're seeing a country both decrease in manufacturing and also decrease in those other jobs that I was mentioning with the ideas of key service jobs. If they're doing that, then the economy is actually collapsing. And there's a difference between the economic collapse, and that is a complete different area of discussion, comparing the economic collapse with the actual development of an economy and the evolution of an economy. You cannot de-evolve an economy. If you de-evolve an economy, you're just going to make the people poorer and basically put them at risk of actual injuries on the job. You can't do that within and say, oh, we want more money for these jobs. You're not going to compete then. That's the thing with it. You're trying to basically say, we want basically, in many cases, 5, 6, 7 times the wages of what people are making globally, and we want to basically produce at 1/3 of the rate. So you're basically saying we want to basically earn about in equal in production level about 30 times the wages, and a company is going to have to tell you no. Well, you're not going to bully that company. The company is eventually going to leave, and that's why when I've talked about nationalism really is no different than socialism. Socialism in the actual countrywide scale eventually does use nationalism because they don't want the companies to book, and that's the reason why they use nationalism. And there really is no different because an authoritarian is an authoritarian. And I basically cut it here because I've gone over the ideas of the points of why trade deficits don't matter. I think I've covered everything, and that's about it. And bye, everyone.